Teresita Basa. She was a respiratory therapist in Chicago who gave free piano lessons to neighborhood children. She was killed inside her own apartment. And the person who eventually named her killer was a co-worker who said the information had come from Teresita herself, months after her death. Teresita Basa had been born in the Philippines in 1929 and had built a quiet, cultured life in Chicago by the time she reached her late 40s. She held a master's degree in music. She worked at Edgewater Hospital in the respiratory unit, and outside of work she gave piano lessons to neighborhood children at no charge. She was 47, single, and living alone in an apartment on the north side of the city. On February 21st, 1977, firefighters responded to a fire in her building. When they entered her apartment, they found her on the floor of her bedroom. A kitchen knife had been driven into her chest. Her body had been arranged to suggest a sexual assault, though the medical examiner determined she had not been assaulted, and a burning mattress had been placed on top of her in what appeared to be an attempt to destroy evidence. Nothing about the scene made sense to detectives. There was no sign of forced entry, no obvious motive, and no suspect anywhere in the case file. For months, the case went nowhere. Detectives had a note in the apartment with the initials A.S. and little else. Then, in the summer of that year, a woman named Remedios Chua, a co-worker of Teresita's at Edgewater Hospital, told her husband something disturbing. She said that when she went into a light trance or fell asleep, she felt as though Teresita was speaking through her. And through those episodes, a name kept coming forward. Alan Showery, an orderly who had worked in the same department. According to the Chua account, the name came with details. Showery had planned to fix Teresita's television. He had taken jewelry from the apartment. The jewelry had been given to his girlfriend. Remedios Chua's husband, a doctor, eventually brought the account to the Chicago Police Department. Detective Joseph Stachula was skeptical of the paranormal claim, but chose to follow the tip. What he found was that Alan Showery did live near Teresita, did work in her department, and had told co-workers he intended to help her with an electrical problem in her apartment. When investigators approached his girlfriend, she produced jewelry that had belonged to Teresita, and Teresita's family confirmed the pieces as hers. Showery was arrested. He initially confessed to the killing, then later tried to walk the confession back, telling officers he had only been joking. But the jewelry was real, the connections were real, and the case was built on that physical evidence, not on the co-worker's account. How much of what Remedios Chua reported can actually be believed? That question hung over the case then, and it still does. Chua worked in the same unit as both Teresita and Showery. Showery had filed a complaint against her at work. She had reasons to know things about him that were not paranormal at all. Detective Stachula himself later told reporters that he was not entirely sure how she had obtained the information, but that the underlying facts had checked out. The first trial, held in 1978, ended with a hung jury. A second proceeding began the following winter. On February 23, 1979, Alan Showery pleaded guilty to murder, robbery, and arson. He was sentenced to 14 years in prison. He served roughly 5 of them before being released on parole in 1983. As of today, Alan Showery's whereabouts are not publicly known. He would be in his 70s or 80s. There have been no additional charges filed against him. Teresita Basa's family, who had traveled from the Philippines to attend the proceedings, buried her back home. The case became one of the most talked about in Chicago true crime history. largely because of the co-worker's claim, though the conviction itself rested on evidence any detective would recognize. Physical items in the wrong hands, and a suspect who could not explain why. The following case begins with a body found in a cornfield, and with 2 handwritten notes in the pockets that no one on earth has ever been able to read. Ricky McCormick. His body was found in a cornfield in Missouri in 1999. In his pockets, folded up, were 2 handwritten notes covered in coded letters and numbers. More than a quarter-century later, the notes have never been decoded. No one has ever been charged, and the FBI still lists them among the top unsolved ciphers in its files. Ricky McCormick was 41 years old at the time of his death. He had grown up in the greater St. Louis area, had dropped out of high school, and by the accounts of his family, was functionally illiterate. He had chronic heart and lung problems, no steady employment, and a minor criminal record. He did not drive. He was last seen alive on June 25, 1999, at Forest Park Hospital, where he had been receiving medical treatment. 5 days later, on June 30th, his partially decomposed body was found in a cornfield in St. Charles County, near the small community of West Alton, roughly 15 miles from where he lived. The cause of death was initially ruled undetermined. The FBI would later treat the case as a homicide. How he had traveled the 15 miles to that field and who had taken him there has never been explained. When investigators searched his clothing, they found 2 folded pieces of paper. Both had been written in his own hand. Both contained more than 30 lines of what appeared to be code. Letters, numbers, parentheses, arranged in dense clusters, without spaces or clear structure. Investigators assumed the notes might explain where he had been, who he had been with, or why he had ended up in that field. Instead, they became a mystery of their own. The FBI's Cryptanalysis and Racketeering Records Unit, the same team that works on organized crime ciphers and terrorism cases, took the notes for analysis. They could not break them. Neither could the American Cryptogram Association, which was later given access. In March of 2011, 12 years after the body was found, the FBI took an unusual step and released the notes to the public. The head of the Cryptanalysis Unit at the time, Dan Olson, told reporters that his team was skilled at what they did, but that this particular case had defeated them. He said breaking the code could reveal where Ricky had been in the days before his death, and could lead directly to the person responsible. Tens of thousands of amateur codebreakers took a look. None of them produced a solution that investigators found convincing. The complication is that Ricky's own family disputes the entire premise. His mother, Frankie Sparks, said publicly that her son could barely write his own name, let alone construct 30 lines of encoded text. His cousin echoed the same account. The family also said they had not been told about the existence of the notes until they saw the FBI's public appeal on the news 12 years after his death. If Ricky did not write those notes, who did? That is the version of the case that unsettles investigators the most. It would mean the writing on the pages was left behind by whoever brought him to that cornfield, either planted on the body deliberately or slipped into his pockets before he was moved. Prior persons of interest were looked at over the years. A former employer, a local drug dealer with connections to the area. Neither could be tied to the death in a way that produced charges. No arrest was ever made, no confession ever surfaced, and the cornfield yielded no additional evidence. As of today, the case remains open and unsolved. The FBI has not withdrawn the appeal. The notes are still cataloged among the top unresolved ciphers on file. The family has not received answers about how Ricky reached that field, who was with him, or what the code, if it is code, was meant to say. The pages sit in an evidence locker in Missouri, untouched by any known method of analysis, holding whatever information Ricky did or did not put on them the last time he held a pen. The case that follows is not a mystery of what was written, but of what a river carried away, and of a young woman whose killer walked free for more than 4 decades before science finally caught up with him. Kathy Hall. She left her apartment in a Chicago suburb on a spring afternoon in 1979 to pick up her sister from a shopping center. She never made it. Her killer would remain unidentified for the next 45 years. Kathy Hall was 19 years old, living on Volks Court in North Aurora, Illinois, and working at the nearby Northgate Shopping Center. Friends and family remembered her as a bright presence with feathered hair, glasses, and a warm, easy manner. She was starting the earliest part of an adult life. That life ended on March 29, 1979. That afternoon, she left home to drive to the shopping center to collect her younger sister. Her sister waited. Kathy did not arrive. Later, her car was found back at her own apartment complex parking lot. Behind the driver's seat, investigators found blood. Kathy herself was not in the car and was nowhere to be found. Nearly a month later, on April 24, 1979, her body was pulled from the Fox River. Investigators worked the case with everything 1979 investigative science had to offer. Neighbors were canvassed, co-workers were interviewed, and boyfriends and acquaintances were cleared. And then, as often happens in this era of cold cases, the leads ran out. There was no confession, no eyewitness, no physical evidence that pointed to a specific individual. Kathy's file was moved to the cold case archive, where it stayed for decades. The break, when it came from a different case entirely. In the neighboring Chicago suburbs, another young woman named Pamela Maurer had been killed in 1976. In 2019, investigators used forensic genetic genealogy to identify a suspect in that case. His name was Bruce Everett Lindahl. Lindahl had died in 1981 at the age of 29 when he accidentally severed his own femoral artery during an attack on another victim in Naperville. He had bled out at the scene. Investigators in the western Chicago suburbs had long suspected that Lindahl might be responsible for a string of unsolved cases from the late 70s. What they had not had was proof. The Pamela Maurer identification changed that. Once Lindahl's DNA profile was on file, other cold cases became testable. Could Lindahl have been responsible for the death of Kathy Hall? The North Aurora Police Department reopened her file. They found that Lindahl had frequented the Northgate Shopping Center where Kathy worked. They pulled her preserved evidence, including items of clothing that had been stored since 1979, and sent them to a laboratory in Florida that specialized in extracting DNA from old and difficult samples. Using a wet vacuum system designed to lift trace material from fabric, the lab was able to obtain a usable profile. In August of 2024, that profile was compared to Lindahl's. The match was overwhelming. On October 23rd of that year, North Aurora Detective Ryan Peet announced the finding. The DNA on Kathy Hall's clothing was, by the calculation of the lab, roughly 9.4 trillion times more likely to have come from Bruce Lindahl than from any unrelated individual. Investigators formally concluded that Lindahl was responsible for her death. Because Lindahl had died in 1981, there could be no arrest, no indictment, and no trial. The Kane County State's attorney at the time, Jamie Mosser, said publicly that had he lived, her office would have filed first-degree murder charges and pursued them. As of today, the Kathy Hall case is considered solved by the identification of a deceased offender. Her file has been formally closed. Lindahl remains suspected in a range of other unsolved cases across the western Chicago suburbs, and investigators in several jurisdictions have indicated they intend to continue testing preserved evidence against his profile. Kathy's family, who had waited 45 years for an answer, received one from a detective in a briefing room in the fall of 2024. It did not bring her back, but it ended a question that had lasted a lifetime. The story that follows begins not with a body, but with an empty house, a former beauty queen turned schoolteacher, and a small Georgia town where a disappearance would produce the largest investigative file in the state's history. Tara Grinstead. She was a former beauty queen who taught history to teenagers in a small Georgia farming town. One October night, she went home from a cookout and disappeared. What followed became the largest missing persons case in the history of the Georgia Bureau of Investigation. Tara Grinstead was 30 years old, born in November of 1974, and by the fall of 2005 had built her life inside a very small radius. She had graduated from Georgia colleges, competed in pageants, and taken the Miss Tifton title in 1999. She taught 11th grade history at Irwin County High School in the town of Ocilla, population under 3,500. She lived alone in a small house near the school. Her students loved her. Her colleagues respected her. On the evening of October 22, 2005, she attended a beauty pageant she had helped judge, then went to a cookout at a friend's house. She left the cookout by herself and drove home. That is the last time she was seen alive. The next morning, her car was in her driveway. Her house was locked. Inside, her purse was on the counter, her cell phone was there, and her keys were on the floor. There was a broken lamp in the bedroom, and a latex glove was found in the yard. Her students noticed she was not at school. Her family began calling. By the following day, the community realized that Tara Grinstead had disappeared without taking her wallet, her phone, or her car. The Georgia Bureau of Investigation opened what would become the largest case file in its history. In physical form, it eventually reached roughly 90 volumes of documents. Every lead was chased. Investigators looked at boyfriends, ex-boyfriends, co-workers, and fellow pageant judges. A man in Florida who sent an anonymous video claiming to have taken her turned out to be a hoaxer and was prosecuted. Years passed. A podcast called Up and Vanished, released in 2016, revived national attention on the case. And in February of 2017, a tip changed everything. Could someone Tara had never taught and never known well have been the person responsible? That tip led investigators to two former Irwin County High School students, Ryan Duke and Bo Dukes. Ryan Duke was arrested and gave a confession to the GBI. He said he had broken into Tara's home that night to steal money to buy drugs. He said he had killed her. He said Bo Dukes had helped him dispose of the body, burning her at a pecan orchard belonging to the Dukes family. Bone fragments were later recovered from that orchard. Bo Dukes was convicted in Wilcox County in 2019 on charges of concealing a death, lying to investigators, and hindering apprehension of a criminal. He received a 25-year sentence for that role. Ryan Duke's own trial did not begin until 2022, and when it did, he changed his story on the stand. He testified that his confession had been false. He said Bo Dukes was the actual killer and that he had implicated himself out of fear. On May 20th, 2022, the jury acquitted Ryan Duke of malice murder, felony murder, aggravated assault, and burglary. He was convicted of only one count, concealing a death. He was sentenced to the maximum of 10 years. As of today, Ryan Duke remains in Georgia state custody. he was denied parole in June of 2023. His maximum release date is February 12, 2027. In early 2025, the Georgia Court of Appeals threw out additional charges against both men related to the burning of the body. Ruling those charges had been filed too late under the state statute of limitations. Tara Grinstead's disappearance, at this moment, has no one charged with the actual killing. Bo Dukes and Ryan Duke stand convicted only of what came after. The next case begins on a highway in northwest Georgia, with a young woman found beside the road whose name no one would learn for more than 3 decades. Stacy Lynn Shahorsky. Her body was found in December of 1988 along an interstate in the mountains of Georgia. She had no identification on her. For the next 33 years, no one knew her name. She was buried under a placeholder, and the man responsible for her death would remain unknown to investigators for the same 3 decades. Stacy Lynn Shahorsky was 19 years old, from Norton Shores, Michigan. She had left home to travel, moving through the country with the freedom that a young person in the 1980s, without a cell phone or a permanent address, still had. She wrote and called home when she could. The last time her mother heard from her was in September of 1988. When the calls stopped, her family reported her missing in January of 1989. By that time, Stacy was already gone. Her body had been found on December 16, 1988, along the northbound side of Interstate 59 in Dade County, Georgia, about 5 miles from the Alabama state line. She had been strangled. She carried no wallet, no license, and nothing to link her to a hometown. Investigators tried to identify her through dental records, missing persons databases, and news bulletins. Nothing worked. She was buried in Georgia under the name Rising Fawn Jane Doe, a reference to the small community nearest to where she was found. The Dade County Sheriff's Office kept the file open. Every few years, technology or a lead would give them reason to hope. Every few years, that hope would run out. In 2022, 34 years after she was found, the FBI and the GBI announced they had partnered with a private laboratory in Texas called Othram that specialized in forensic genetic genealogy. Working from her preserved DNA, the lab was able to build a family tree that led investigators to her relatives. In March of that year, they were able to tell those relatives that their daughter, sister, and cousin had been found in Georgia decades earlier. Stacy Lynn Shahorsky finally had her name back. Could the same technology name her killer? That was the second question, and it was a harder one. The FBI and GBI had preserved DNA from the crime scene believed to belong to the person responsible. Working from that profile, Othram built a second family tree. On June 13, 2022, they had a result. Investigators interviewed relatives of the individual identified by the profile. And on September 6th of that year, they held a public news conference to announce that they had identified her killer. His name was Henry Frederick Wise, known as Hoss. He had been a long-haul truck driver for a company whose route ran through the Georgia mountains along Interstate 59. He had also been a stunt driver at auto racing events. In 1988, he would have been about 34 years old. He had a criminal record that predated the modern DNA collection systems, so his profile was not on file in any law enforcement database. At the press conference, the FBI special agent in charge of the Atlanta division noted that this was, to their knowledge, the first case in which forensic genetic genealogy had been used to identify both the victim and the person responsible for her death in the same investigation. There would be no trial. Henry Wise had died in 1999, in a stunt car crash and fire at Myrtle Beach Speedway in South Carolina at the age of 44. As of today, the Stacy Chihorsky case is considered solved by the identification of a deceased suspect. Her remains, once buried in Georgia under a name that was not hers, were returned to her family in Michigan. Her mother, who had waited 33 years for an answer, received one before her own life ended. Henry Wise had no known connection to Stacy before that stretch of interstate. Investigators believe it was a single encounter between a young woman traveling alone and a long-haul driver whose route brought him through the area. There were no other charges filed. There is no one else to hold responsible. Not subscribed yet? Now's the time. And if audio's more your thing, find us on Spotify too. You can click the link in our bio. Mary Catherine Edwards. She was a beloved elementary school teacher in Beaumont, Texas, whose identical twin sister taught in the same district. She was killed in her own bathtub on a Friday in 1995. And the person responsible had been sitting in her wedding photos more than a decade earlier. Mary Catherine Edwards was 31 years old, a teacher at Price Elementary School in Beaumont. Her identical twin sister, Allison, taught in a Beaumont classroom of her own. Mary was known among her colleagues and her students for a habit that sounded small, but that people remembered. She bought snacks for the children in her class out of her own pocket. She had a beagle. She had a townhouse on a quiet street. On Friday, January 13th, 1995, she was seen alive by coworkers at the end of the school day. Over the weekend, her parents realized they could not reach her by phone. On Saturday, January 14th, they went to her townhouse and found her. She had been bound at the wrists, sexually assaulted, and drowned in her own bathtub. The medical examiner listed both drowning and asphyxiation on the death certificate. There was no forced entry. Whoever had come into her home, she had let inside, or he had let himself in, with a key. Beaumont police worked the case with everything they had in 1995. DNA was preserved from the scene, but the technology of the time could not identify a suspect from it. The pool of possible suspects grew, then shrank, then stalled. For 26 years, Mary's family, and especially her twin sister, waited. In 2021, the Texas Rangers reopened the case and sent the preserved DNA to a private laboratory. Working with a professional genetic genealogist, they built a family tree from the profile. That tree narrowed to 2 brothers. One of the brothers had a criminal record, the other did not. Investigators focused on the one with the record. His name was Clayton Bernard Foreman. Could the person who had done this to Mary have known her his entire life? That was the question the Rangers had to face, because Clayton Foreman was not a stranger. He and Mary had gone to the same high school in Beaumont. He had known her as a classmate. He had been married in 1982, and Mary Catherine Edwards had been a bridesmaid at his wedding. What investigators did not have to search hard for was a pattern. In 1981, before that wedding, Foreman had pleaded guilty to raping a classmate. In that earlier case, he had bound the victim's hands and held a knife to her throat. By 2021, Foreman was living in Reynoldsburg, Ohio. On April 15th of that year, agents from FBI Cincinnati and local police conducted what investigators call a trash pull. They recovered DNA from items he had discarded. When that DNA was compared to the profile from Mary's townhouse in 1995, it matched. Foreman was arrested on April 29th, 2021. He fought extradition to Texas. He was eventually returned and indicted for capital murder in June of that year. His trial began on March 11, 2024, in Jefferson County. 7 days of testimony followed. The jury heard about the DNA. They heard about the 1981 plea. They heard about the friendship that had once linked Foreman to Mary's own family. On the 8th day, after roughly 50 minutes of deliberation, they returned a verdict of guilty of capital murder. The state did not seek the death penalty. Foreman was sentenced to life in prison. Under the terms of his sentence, he will not become eligible for parole for 30 years, which would place him in his 90s. As of today, Clayton Foreman is serving that sentence within the Texas Department of Criminal Justice. In the 2025 to 2026 term, the Ninth Court of Appeals in Texas upheld his conviction, rejecting every argument his defense had raised, including a challenge to the admission of the 1981 prior offense and a challenge to the use of genetic genealogy testimony. His direct appeal is closed. Mary Catherine Edwards is buried in Beaumont. Her twin sister still teaches in the district they both once served. The story that comes next also began in 1988, in a small Michigan apartment, where the only witness to a young woman's death was her 9-month-old daughter, sleeping in the next room. Kathy Swartz. She was a 19-year-old mother living in a townhouse in southwestern Michigan with her fiancé and their baby daughter. On a December afternoon in 1988, a friend went by to check on her and found her dead in the apartment. The baby was in the next room, and on the walls, written in Kathy's blood, were words that would haunt investigators for the next 35 years. Kathy Sue Swartz was described by the people who loved her as sweet, artistic, and a tomboy who loved hunting with her father. She had a 9-month-old daughter named Courtney. She lived with her fiancé, Mike Warner, at Riverside Apartments in the town of Three Rivers, Michigan. She was at the earliest edge of the adult life she was building. On December 2, 1988, a friend came by the apartment. What she found inside was the kind of scene that changes the people who investigate it. Kathy had been beaten, stabbed more than a dozen times, and strangled. There were signs of an attempted sexual assault. Baby Courtney was unharmed in her crib in the next room. She would grow up without any memory of the woman who was her mother. There was no forced entry into the apartment. Whoever had come in, Kathy had opened the door. And there was something else. Blood had been smeared throughout the apartment, and among those smears were phrases. According to the reporting of the South Bend Tribune at the time, the words "I was here" and other short phrases had been written on surfaces in Kathy's own blood. Investigators looked at every possible interpretation. Ritual activity was considered and then ruled out. A local detective told reporters at the time that there was no evidence of any cult presence at the scene. The writing was disturbing, but it did not fit a recognizable pattern. Early suspicion fell on an ex-boyfriend named Troy Schultes, who was interviewed, submitted to a polygraph examination, and cleared. And the case, without a viable suspect and without the DNA technology that would have made a difference, went cold. The file sat in the Michigan State Police Cold Case Archive for more than 3 decades. In 2022, investigators sent crime scene DNA to Othram, the same Texas laboratory that had worked on the Chehorsky case. Forensic genetic genealogy narrowed the suspect pool to a single family. That family had 4 brothers. Over the course of the following months, 3 of the brothers were tested and eliminated. The 4th brother, living in South Carolina, remained. Could someone from Kathy's own hometown have walked into her apartment that day? That is what the evidence began to suggest. His name was Robert Odell Waters. He was 53 years old, living in Beaufort, South Carolina, and running a plumbing business. He had grown up in the same area as Kathy. Investigators learned that he had a childhood friend or classmate connection to her circle, and that he had shown up at Kathy's apartment approximately a month before her death. For 35 years, Robert Waters had lived a life that had never included a fingerprint or DNA sample in a law enforcement database. When Michigan State Police were able to obtain his DNA and compare it to the profile from the crime scene, it matched. Waters was arrested on April 30th, 2023, and charged with open murder. He waived extradition to Michigan. But before he could be transferred, on May 6th of that year, he was found dead by suicide in his cell in the Beaufort County Jail. He had been in custody for about a week. As of today, the Kathy Swartz case is considered closed. Michigan State Police stated that Robert Waters had acted alone and that no additional suspects were being sought. The Western Michigan University Cold Case Program, which had helped organize the more than 10,000 pages of documents in the file, said its work on the case was complete. There will be no trial, no plea, and no explanation from Waters himself of why he came into that apartment, of what the writing on the walls was meant to mean, or of what he did to earn 35 years of quiet freedom. Kathy's daughter, Courtney, is now in her 30s. She was raised by relatives and finally learned the name of the man responsible for her mother's death, decades after the fact. The story that follows moved through the courts for more than 2 decades, involving a pregnant teacher, a husband who called it a burglary, and a jury that had to decide the same question 3 separate times. Belinda Temple. She was 8 months pregnant when she was killed in her own Texas home. Her husband, a former high school football star, told police it was a home invasion. Investigators did not believe him, and it would take 3 trials, over 24 years, to reach a verdict that held. Belinda Temple was 30 years old, a special education teacher at Katy High School in Katy, Texas. Her identical twin sister was Brenda Lucas. Belinda and her husband, David, already had a 3-year-old son. She was in the final weeks of a pregnancy with their second child, a daughter. On January 11th, 1999, David Temple called 911 from the family's home. He told the operator he had come back from running errands with their young son and had found the back door glass broken and Belinda dead in a closet in the couple's bedroom. She had been shot in the back of the head with a shotgun. Her unborn child did not survive. David Temple was a former Katy High football standout who was, at the time, an assistant football coach at Alif Hastings High School. To the responding officers, the burglary story did not fit. Nothing had been stolen from the home. The family dog, which barked at any stranger, had not deterred an intruder. The angle of the injury did not fit the story of someone who had come into the house at random. And investigators would later learn that David had been involved in an affair with a fellow teacher, Heather Scott. He and Scott would marry approximately 2 years after Belinda's death. The defense had its own theory. It pointed at a 16-year-old neighbor who had access to a shotgun, who had skipped school on the day of the killing, and who had initially lied to investigators about where he had been. The case moved slowly. David Temple was not indicted until 2004. His first trial ended in November of 2007 with a conviction and a life sentence. Was the conviction going to hold? That was the question that dominated the years that followed. In 2016, the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals overturned the conviction, ruling that the lead prosecutor, Kelly Siegler, had committed misconduct by withholding evidence from the defense about other possible suspects in what is known as a Brady violation. David Temple was released on bond after almost a decade in prison. A second trial was scheduled. That trial began in August of 2019. The jury again returned a verdict of guilty. But when it moved to the punishment phase, it deadlocked. A mistrial was declared as to sentencing only. A third proceeding was ordered, this one strictly to determine the sentence. That third proceeding was held in April of 2023. The jury sentenced him to life in prison and a fine of $10,000. As of today, David Temple's conviction stands. On July 3, 2025, the Texas 14th Court of Appeals rejected all 10 of the appellate arguments his defense had raised and affirmed the conviction in full. The Texas Court of Criminal Appeals declined to take discretionary review of that ruling. One justice dissented. His direct appeals within the state system are exhausted. Federal habeas corpus review remains theoretically available to him, but no filing has been announced. He will not be eligible for parole until 2044. Belinda's twin sister, Brenda Lucas, has spoken publicly on behalf of Belinda for more than 25 years. She was involved in each of the 3 trials, each of the appeals, and each of the resentencings. The shotgun used in the killing has never been recovered. The murder weapon remains missing to this day. The case does not have the neat structure of the ones broken open by science. It has the structure of a long, slow prosecution in which the state believed, from the beginning, that it knew what had happened and had to prove it 3 times over to a court system that gave the defense every opportunity to disagree. In the end, none of those opportunities was enough to move the outcome. The story that follows begins with an unidentified woman in a vacant field in California in 1968, and with a family in Maine who spent 52 years waiting for a knock on the door. Anita Louise Pitot. Her body was found by 3 boys in a vacant field in Huntington Beach, California, in 1968. She had no identification. For the next 52 years, her family in Maine did not know she was dead, and California authorities did not know who she was. Anita Louise Pitot had been born in Augusta, Maine, on March 9, 1942, one of 7 children in the Pitot family. In 1967, at the age of 25, she had moved to the Los Angeles area, looking for a new chapter of her life. She wrote letters home. Her family in Maine treasured them. The letters stopped in February of 1968. On March 14, 1968, 5 days after her 26th birthday, 3 boys found her body in a vacant field near Newland Street and Yorktown Avenue in Huntington Beach. She had been sexually assaulted, severely beaten, and killed by a slash to the throat. Nothing on her person identified her. Fingerprint checks and dental records produced nothing. She was buried in Newport Beach in an unmarked grave. She would remain, in Orange County records, the Huntington Beach Jane Doe. She was the oldest unidentified female homicide victim in the county's history. Her family in Maine, meanwhile, did what families of the disappeared do. They waited. They wondered. Years turned into decades. Her siblings had children who never knew their aunt existed. The break came from investigative genetic genealogy. Beginning around 2017, according to at least one podcast that tracked the case, and formally through the Orange County District Attorney's Investigative Task Force. By 2019, Huntington Beach Police and the Orange County DA's office partnered with the genealogist Colleen Fitzpatrick. Investigators exhumed the Jane Doe's remains in April of 2019 so that a stronger DNA profile could be obtained. That profile was uploaded to a public genealogy database. It produced a cousin-level match to a person in Maine. That person recognized the description and identified Anita from an old obituary in the family. Two of her siblings, Anne and Raymond, submitted their own DNA. The results confirmed it. Could science also name the man who had done this to Anita? The Orange County DA's team believed it could try. They had preserved a cigarette butt from the crime scene. Using the DNA from that cigarette, they built a second family tree. That tree narrowed to the Crisco family. A deceased brother in the family had had a biopsy sample preserved for medical reasons, and comparing that biopsy to the crime scene DNA gave investigators the identification they needed. His name was Johnny Monroe Crisco. He would have been about 24 in 1968. He had briefly enlisted in the Army and had been discharged after a psychological evaluation that used a term the DA's office quoted in its announcement, describing him as quick to anger, easily feeling unjustly treated, chronically resentful, immature, and impulsive. He had a history of violence. He had never been an original suspect. He had lived and died in Bremerton, Washington. He had died of cancer in 2015. On July 23, 2020, the Orange County District Attorney, Todd Spitzer, held a press conference to announce the identification of both Anita and the man they believed had killed her. He acknowledged plainly that Crisco's death had prevented the full imposition of justice, but said the office's persistence had made sure the moment eventually came when they could tell Anita's family who had ended her life. Because Crisco had died in 2015, no charges were ever filed. He was only ever named a suspect. He was never indicted. Investigators were also never able to establish how he and Anita crossed paths, and they continued to appeal for any information from members of the public who might have known either of them at the time. As of today, the case has never been formally reclassified in publicly accessible records as cleared by exceptional means. The July 2020 announcement remains the most recent authoritative statement on the case. Anita Louise Pitot was disinterred from her unmarked grave in California and reburied in Waterville, Maine, in July of 2020. Her siblings finally had a place to visit her. 52 years after she left Augusta looking for a new life, she came home. The final story of this list also began in the 1980s. In a Michigan kitchen with a husband who spent 35 years under suspicion for something he did not do. Roxanne Wood. She was 30 years old, a lifelong Michigan resident, and by every account, the bright light in a large and close family. She was killed in her own kitchen in 1987. For the next 35 years, her own husband lived under the shadow of being suspected of doing it. Roxanne Lee Wood had been born and raised in Niles, Michigan, had graduated from Niles High School in 1974, and had married her husband Terry. Her sister described her, years later, as the family's bright light on earth. She and Terry had built a settled life together in a small town. On the evening of February 19th, 1987, Roxanne and Terry went out separately. Terry had been at a bowling alley. When he returned home, about 45 minutes after Roxanne, he found her in the kitchen. She had been beaten with a frying pan and killed by a slash to the throat. She had also been sexually assaulted. There was no forced entry. Terry Wood called for help. From that first phone call, he was the person investigators looked at hardest. In a case with no forced entry, with a sexual assault, and with a husband who had come home to find his wife dead, the pattern was familiar. The town looked at him too. According to reporting on the case, he was quietly nicknamed Slash by some in the community. For 35 years, he lived with what that meant. Michigan State Police cold case investigators kept the file. Terry submitted to interviews. His DNA was on record with investigators for comparison purposes. It did not match the crime scene. But for years there was no other profile to compare against, and the whispers in the community did not go away. That began to change with the wider use of forensic genetic genealogy. Michigan State Police, working with the Western Michigan University Cold Case Program and a company called Identifinders International, took the crime scene DNA and built a full genome-sequenced profile. That profile was uploaded to public genealogy databases. A genealogist named Gabriela Vargas reportedly worked out the relevant family tree in a matter of days. Could the person responsible have been someone with no known connection to Roxanne at all? That was the question the profile answered. In June of 2021, investigators surveilled a man they believed matched the family tree and collected a cigarette butt he discarded. The DNA on that cigarette matched the crime scene. Terry Wood was cleared, formally and completely, for the first time in 35 years. The suspect's name was Patrick Wayne Gilham. He was 67 years old at the time of his arrest, living in South Bend, Indiana, about 4 to 10 miles from where the Wood home had been. In 1987, at the time of Roxanne's death, he had been on parole for approximately 6 months. He had served 7 years for a 1980 sexual assault and home invasion in Gary, Indiana, in which the victim, a woman named Maureen Farag, had survived. Investigators believe Roxanne and Gilham had never previously crossed paths. Gilham was arrested on February 17, 2022, near the 35th anniversary of Roxanne's death. He was charged with open murder and breaking and entering. In March of that year, he pleaded no contest to second-degree murder, telling the court he could not remember the crime and attributing that to substance abuse at the time. On April 25, 2022, he was sentenced to a term of 23 to 50 years in Michigan Department of Corrections custody. Prosecutors said that, at his age, the 23-year minimum effectively meant a life sentence. He apologized to the family in court. As of today, Patrick Gilham remains in Michigan State custody. The Michigan State Police have said other agencies are examining Gilham in connection with unsolved cases from the same era, given his history and geography. Terry Wood, who had spent more than half his life under a cloud of suspicion, was publicly cleared by the same technology that produced the arrest. Roxanne's family finally had the answer they had waited for, and Terry finally had his name back. Every one of these cases proves that time does not bury the truth, only delays it. Thanks for watching. Click here to see our next video.